call.
Don't forget Edward Smith, who died at the defendant's hands.
He states that he had oral sex with this individual and then killed him by the same procedure, drugging him until he slept, strangling him, and dismembering him.
Jeffrey stated that he went to Sears and bought a 5-square-foot floor freezer with locking top to store the defleshed bones. He also purchased 2 30-gallon plastic trash bags to put the defleshed remains in. He poured muriatic acid to acidify the flesh and then flushed the remains down the toilet.
Yes, after the complaint about the smell, and somebody actually identified his apartment as the source of the smell. So I had called and talked to him in the office and went with him to his apartment.
And what excuse did he give at that time?
He said his deep freezer broke and he had meat in it that's getting spoiled. I thought he was a nice guy at the time.
No further questions.
Don't forget Ernest Miller, who was stabbed to death by the defendant because he was becoming conscious. The defendant had to get a drink to do it. Don't forget Ernest Smith.
He had only a few pills available. While the victim was asleep, he thought, quote, "How should I keep him?" end quote. He did not want to put this person through any pain, and consequently he stabbed him in the jugular. He painted the skull with granite spray paint. He tried tasting the flesh and the heart. He bought a tenderizer, tenderized the heart, and ate it and the muscle meat. He reported that it had a beef-like flavor. It gave him a sexual thrill while eating it. He felt that the man was a part of him and he had internalized him.
Don't forget David Thomas, strangled by the defendant.
Mr. Dahmer told the police that once he had David Thomas back to his apartment, he thought that David Thomas wasn't really his type, and he killed him because he had already given him the sleeping potion and thought that Thomas would wake up and be angry.
Don't forget Curtis Straughter, strangled to death by the defendant.
Quote, "He was gay and he wanted anal sex, so I made the drink mixture. He fell asleep, used the handcuffs. This was the first time I used handcuffs. Strangled him, took pictures."
Don't forget Earl Lindsay, first drilled and eventually killed by the defendant.
This is the first of the instances in which he drilled a hole into his victim's skull. And here Mr. Dahmer reported that he first drugged Mr. Lindsay and thereafter used what he described as the drilling technique on the top of his skull. And we discussed this in some detail. In the course of that discussion, he said that after initially having drilled the hole and injected I would call it a syringe, it's a baster actually, a syringe full of muriatic acid into the cranial cavity of Mr. Lindsay, that Mr. Lindsay woke up. And when he regained consciousness, Mr. Dahmer said he was groggy when he woke up, but still coherent and aware of his surroundings. And so I figured it was a failure. Gave him more sleeping pills. He fell asleep. Then I strangled him. Because what Mr. Dahmer wanted here was the compliant sex partner, the zombie as he described it, rather than to have a corpse. It was his intention to keep this man alive if that was going to work, but when he concluded that he had failed to achieve the compliant partner with no will, only then did he strangle him. So another way to look at it is that when he couldn't have the zombie-like creation he was hoping for. He was willing to settle for a corpse. I asked him in that discussion the question, you didn't expect him to wake up and say, yes, master. And he said, no, but that was the general idea. Later in that same conversation, he said, quote, I was just trying to disable the will. And I asked, and subject them to your will? And he said, right.
Don't forget Tony Anthony Hughes, first drilled, then extinguished by the defendant.
Mr. Dahmer didn't try to kill Tony Hughes, but rather Mr. Hughes died through the foreseeable but unintended consequence of this drilling technique. He drilled a hole into his skull and poured in acid, and Mr. Hughes died then, even though it was Mr. Dahmer's intention to keep him alive in this altered state. And so there's no compulsion here to kill. He'd not have died. And it was not any impulsive act of killing, but rather a planful act of trying to provide himself with a compliant sexual partner.